Thank you, Brian, and thanks for the opportunity to speak and the kind introduction. So what I'll be talking about is error rates and master protocol. And just to get us started, what am I talking about when I think about a master protocol? I'm talking about a study that tries to answer multiple questions within a single study. So that could be a platform trial where I have multiple treatments that I want to compare against a common control. It could be basket trials where I have one intervention but multiple disease types that might be related, or umbrella trials where I have different treatments for different disease subtypes. Now, what am I worried about? And I'm sorry if you can't read that little cartoon very well, but this, in my view, very well depicts the problem of multiple testing. So here in this cartoon, we're talking about the hypotheses that jelly beans cause acne. There's an investigation ongoing. P-value turns out to be larger than 5%, therefore decided, no, not true. And then there's a bunch of subgroup analyses on the basis of, oh, it might be the different color that causes the acne. And lo and behold, turns out green jelly does indeed cause acne. So what I'm worried about is looking at multiple things, testing over and over again, and risking making a wrong decision. Now, if I'm worried about this, I could use a variety of different ideas how to ensure that my overall risk is acceptable. I can think about the family-wise error rate, which is what I'm going to focus on today, which, if I'm talking about weak control, I'm looking at the probability to reject at least one true null hypothesis, and I want to have that probability controlled at a certain level. And I'm assuming that the global null hypothesis is true. In other words, all treatments, including the control group, have the same effect. That's my underlying assumption. If I want a stronger type of control, strong control of the family-wise error rate, I'm still looking at the same probability, but I'm going to remove that assumption that I know that the global null hypothesis is true. There are obviously other metrics that are of interest, in particular the false discovery rate might be of interest, which controls the proportion of false discoveries amongst all of the discoveries. Now, the question about whether or not one should adjust for multiplicity in the context of master protocols is actually not that clear. And I've just picked out a series of papers here to give you an example about what the controversy or what the discussion is about. So Parker and Weir, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, argued that in order to make a decision about a particular treatment, what happens to other treatments is completely irrelevant. And therefore, I don't need to worry about having multiple tests of different treatments, even if they come in the same study. If I have a situation where I'm testing different subgroups or testing different doses of an intervention, things might be different, and I might want to consider adjusting for multiplicity in this case. In the response letter, Bretz and Koenig say, well, we don't disagree with the original statements, except there's the fundamental assumption that we're working under the global null hypothesis. And we know, in reality, the probability that all treatments are going to be exactly identical isn't going to hold. And so therefore, once you start thinking about more complex possibilities of the truth, you come into a situation where it's going to become important to control, even if you look at different treatments in the same study. Additionally, they argue if you have multiple tests, you often still have a single submission to regulators, and therefore from a regulatory perspective, it's important to make sure that overall your errors are controlled. And so my interpretation of their conclusions is, if nothing else, if you're talking about a confirmatory setting, you ought to be controlling error rates. Now, my personal view is you need to understand what your risk of a false decision is, no matter what your study is, no matter what your setting is. And therefore, okay, one might argue whether one should control or should understand the risk at 2.5% or maybe 10%, but you don't want to be in a situation where just because you haven't looked at it, you haven't thought it through, you might end up with 50, 60, 70% chance of making a wrong decision. And therefore, understanding your risk of making a false decision is going to be important. So, going to the COVID setting, one of the studies that I got involved with is the recovery trial. And here is a schematic of the beginnings of the study. So if you can't read my handwriting there, we get 4 different treatments at the onset of the study compared against standard of care. And then a couple of months later, the trial structure looked something like this. So we had a decision to stop one of the arms because it didn't look sufficiently promising to warrant any further investigation. We had one treatment that showed sufficient promise, and 2 other treatments had been added to the platform. And I think many people by now know quite a bit about how the study ran and the details of the study. But what most people probably don't know is that the initial design of the recovery trial actually was set up to control the family-wise error rate and was set up to control the family-wise error rate in the strong sense at a relatively relaxed overall level of 5%. Now, if you know the study, you know that by the time decisions were made, that plan was scrapped. And the reason why it was scrapped is simply because we didn't know how to. We didn't know how we could, in a dynamic system, in a dynamic trial, where treatments get added, get taken out at unspecified time points, how we could ensure that we end up with overall control of the family-wise error rate. Okay, so the goal here now is to think about, now that we had a bit of time to think about it, can we actually set up a platform trial where we do know what the family-wise error rate is going to be, irrespective of adding treatments and removing treatments. So I'll go back and start off with a simpler version of a platform trial, a multi-arm study. So in this schematic, 4 different active treatments indicated by the different colors, compared against 1 common control group indicated in gray. So everything is known at the beginning. I'm starting off recruiting to those 5 groups and collect my information and make my decisions. I can extend that concept to say, well, maybe I want to make decisions early about treatments being particularly promising or not so promising, and make a multi-stage, in the schematic here, a 2-stage version thereof. So I'll start off with recruiting patients to my 4 groups and control, and then at some point during the conduct of the study, I'll make a decision about which treatments are worthwhile going forward and which ones are not, and then I only continue recruiting to the ones that are potentially useful. So that's my starting point to work through. And so if I'm working in a setting where I have pre-specified how I'm going to make decisions about what's worthwhile and what's not worthwhile, I could have a schematic like this one. On the x-axis, you got number of patients recruited and observed. On the y-axis, you got your test statistic that you might be interested in. The first red and green bars correspond to my first look at the data, at which point, if I have 4 active treatments compared against control, I will have 4 different test statistics, and on the basis of these test statistics, I will make one of 3 decisions. Either, if you happen to be in the red area, in the red region, sorry, it's hopeless. Doesn't look like this is ever going to be showing any positive effect for the patients. So at that point, you give up on that treatment. If you happen to be in the green region, you say, great, I have already sufficient evidence to show that this treatment is better than my standard of care, than my control. I can pop out the champagne and celebrate because I have found a treatment that's statistically significantly better than my comparator. Most often, you'll be in the white space in between, and your conclusion is, I don't know, I need more data. And so you will recruit additional patients to the treatments that are left, plus control, and then ask the question again at your second interim analysis and go on until you end up with a definitive answer. So, no, maybe not. Okay, so in this case, where everything is well pre-specified, the sort of fundamental challenge in making a decision comes from the fact that I have a shared control group. I use the same data for each of my test statistics, which induces a correlation between the test statistics. But otherwise, that probability to make at most one, there we go, to make it at least one false decision, I can just work out. I end up, after doing some algebra, with that sort of unpleasantly looking equation there at the bottom. But you know, it's just integrals. We can ask the computer at least to give us a solution for that. So because everything has been pre-specified in the setting, I can use the structure, I can use the existing correlation, I can find that correlation and work out what my overall error rate is going to be in this case. So that's my starting point, but as I've already alluded, and as you've already seen, in the context of the recovery trial, a platform trial is a bit more complicated in the sense that I'm not only going to always allow to stop because it's hopeless or stop because things look great, but in addition, like in the schematic here, I might decide to add new treatments to the investigation. So let's think about what we can do in this case. So if we do know that I will add treatments to the investigation. So under the assumption that I know exactly when I'm going to add a new treatment, and control group and endpoint that I'm interested in is going to be the same, and the number of patients or the allocation ratio to each of my arms is known a priori, actually turns out the things don't become a whole lot more complicated than before. You can use the same idea, you can condition on the control group and integrate out over it, and then get some equally unpleasantly looking equation for your family-wise error rate, which I'm going to spare you here. So that's good. So if I'm in the lucky situation that I knew exactly when I'm going to add my treatments, we've got a solution. We know how we could investigate and how we could construct a trial that controls our family-wise error rate. Unfortunately, life isn't quite as predictable, and more often than not, you'll find yourself in a situation that you thought maybe 5 months after the start, I'm going to add a new treatment, or 5 years after the start, I'm going to add a new treatment, and then reality strikes and it's going to be a bit earlier or a bit later, because, well, that's what reality looks like. So if I use this idea of having a pre-specified timing of adding a treatment, and I'm starting to deviate, I'm going to run into some problems. So in here, in my graphs, what you see is on the x-axis, the timing of when you add your new treatment, and that dashed line indicates this is when we had planned to add this new treatment. In the top graph, you see the power. At the bottom graph, you see the family-wise error rate for this procedure. And as you can see, if you look at that one point where the dashed line goes through, everything looks great, right? All my family-wise error rate is controlled, and I get 80% power as I would have planned in my study. But as soon as I'm going to move earlier in adding my treatment or later in my treatment, one way or another, I'm going to deviate from my planned characteristics. I'm either going to get an increase in my family-wise error rate, or I'm going to get a decrease in my power, or I get a too high power, depending on what's going on. So unfortunately, as soon as you have a deviation, and you can see there's sort of 3 different approaches of what you could do when this deviation happens, something is going to have to give, and overall your strategy isn't going to result in the operating characteristics that you were hoping for, unfortunately. And that's simply because, well, life is a bit more complicated than pre-planning. But we love pre-planned trial designs, because if we do, we can control everything. We can make sure that the operating characteristics are exactly like we want them to be. Everything is based on sufficient statistics, and every statistician is going to be pleased to see that, right? We can do sample size calculations in an analytic form. We can get confidence intervals that are consistent with the test decision and all sorts of good things. But as I said, arm adding and treatment selection typically is a bit more complicated than pre-planning. So what can we do? Well, fortunately, there is a way out, and that's using an approach that's called the conditional error approach, which is the largest probability of rejecting a null hypothesis with your originally planned test, conditional on the data that you've seen. And then, if you can find an alternative, a new test decision, a new structure of your decision making, if you want, call it BX in this case, for which this conditional error is not any larger than what your original test had given you, then fortunately you will still get control of the family-wise error rate. All the good things that you had from your original test will transport through, will factor through the design. So as long as you can find this new test that gives me this conditional error B of X, I'm going to be good. I'm going to spare you the details here how you can do this in practice. What I want to do in my last couple of minutes is just show you what would happen if I use this conditional error approach. So here is my toy example. I had an initial design where I have planned to look at my data 3 times. I have 2 active treatments and a control group. And I'm going to plan to recruit 10 patients per arm per stage. So every stage I'm going to recruit 30 patients and make a decision about whether or not I'll stop or I'll continue. At the timing of the first interim analysis, let's assume that there are 2 new arms that I would like to add to my trial design. What can I do? Well, there are obviously some sort of natural choices. One could say, well, if there are 2 extra trials, maybe 2 extra treatments, maybe I just start a new trial. So I'll have my old trial looking at 2 treatments, and then have a new trial that looks at an extra 2 treatments. So that's the first sort of block of results that you see here. The second option is, you could say, well, I've only used 30 patients so far. Maybe I'll reset and I'll start a new trial with 4 active treatments now and control instead. And I'll ignore the initial 30 patients that I'd used. So that's my middle block here. And the final option is using this conditional error approach. Now, the individual rows within these blocks correspond to different truths. So the first one is no treatment effect for any of the treatments. So that's my global null hypothesis. Then I have the situation where I have 1 treatment that works, which happens to be the first one, and the others don't. I have the situation where the first and the third one work, and I have the situation where all 4 of them have an effect here on my slides. In terms of the columns of the results, what you can see is the probability to reject at least one hypothesis, the expected number of patients that I would require until I get a decision, as well as the probabilities to reject each of the 4 hypotheses individually. So, what can you see? If I were to run 2 separate trials, then in the first row you see that my overall risk of making an error is going to be 8%, rather than the setting where I had planned for 5% error. So the fact that I now have 2 separate trials means that I'm going to increase my risk of making a mistake. If I go down in rows, you can see the advantage of that is I have a very high chance of finding at least one treatment, rejecting at least one hypothesis. And I'll need around 86, 87 patients until I'll reach my conclusion in this setting. If I were to run a new trial, so forget about the initial 30 patients and then run a multi-arm, multi-stage design, just like the one we've talked about at the beginning, you can see I control my error rates at 5%, just like desired, but the cost of that is that my probabilities to reject go down to around 75 to 90%, depending on your underlying setting. You'd need about 62 patients, 63 patients to reach a conclusion in your new trial, and obviously you had 30 patients before that you didn't use in that decision making, which hopefully every statistician in here is cringing inwardly that I'm even considering that as an option, ignoring data. So great for getting control, but probably not quite ideal. The conditional error, on the other hand, gives me the control at 5% as desired, and it gives me good, but maybe not quite as good, probability of rejecting the null hypotheses, at least one null hypothesis, sort of a halfway house between first option and while still controlling the overall error rate. So I think, hopefully, I have convinced you that this gives me an opportunity to construct a platform trial that's fully flexible, that allows me to add treatments, to remove treatments in a fashion that isn't pre-specified. There is no free lunch, so you're going to have to give a little bit in terms of power. And if you look very closely at the individual results in the table in the bottom part, you'll also see that the probabilities to reject different treatments change depending on when the treatment enters the trial, which isn't the case in some of the other settings. So if I'm looking at the second to the last row, for example, you have about 86% chance of rejecting the first treatment, while you only had about 64% chance to reject the third treatment, even though in reality they're equally good, but because the timing is different and there's this sort of penalty of having more things to consider for the later treatments, you don't get that sort of same balance that we would have liked. So what I've done is, hopefully I've introduced you to a strategy that allows us to control the family-wise error rate in an adaptive, flexible platform trial. I focused on the setting where I have one treatment compared against a single control, but the same concept you could use to look at a trial where I have all pairwise comparisons where I don't have a standard of care to compare against, but I have multiple treatments that I want to face off against each other. You might argue, well, family-wise error rate actually isn't quite the right metric to control, and that's fine. As I said, my view is you need to understand what your risk is, but what your metric is that you control, I'll leave that up to you. But if you're interested in thinking about online control of the false discovery rate, you could look at the paper by David Robertson and see how that would work in this case. With that, I'll thank my collaborators, and I'm happy to take any questions.
That's it. questions from the audience, in-person audience first, and then we'll take from the online audience. So, any questions?
I was expecting a good throw there.
I was hoping to catch it. I suppose one thing about this that I wonder is that during the pandemic, for instance, the virus itself changed and mutated. So over time through the trial, you might not be treating quite the same thing.
Yeah.
And I wondered how that might change your decisions here or alter the way you would deal with it.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the concern is that, okay, what's your control group? Is that going to be the same at the beginning and the end? So I think one thing that's a general principle I think that's important is that any decisions, especially in a quickly evolving setting, should be made against concurrent control patients only. Now, there might be situations where you are a bit more relaxed about or less worried about changing of that standard, but in the pandemic setting, definitely there's a lot of changes. So for me, that's the first thing you ought to do, and make sure that you compare like with like only rather than go back in time. So that's going to help you a little bit. In terms of the decision making, as long as the changes in standard of care are factored through all the treatments in the same way, you would still get control of the error rate in the same way, fortunately. But obviously, if they're disproportionately affected, all these results will no longer hold.
I just don't trust my throw. That's the problem. Okay, we can pass it down.
Right. So one thing with the design of adding in new arms, not to be Bayesian, but is there something about the decision to add new arms itself? So that the work at the moment kind of assumes that the new arms that are added in are sort of independent, but surely the reason you add in new arms might be based on some continuing work.
Yeah, so I mean, you're definitely right. The assumption here is that new treatments are completely independent of your other treatments. I think the question that you're posing is interesting, particularly because I'd be less worried about, okay, there's a continuation of development unless it's a combination treatment that builds on treatment A in my trial. I think the assumption of independence there is okay. I think what I'd be more worried about is that you might want to add a treatment at a point where you've just found something working, and so you actually have a change in your control group rather than the relationship. And that's, I think, a very, very practical question, a very relevant practical question about, okay, in that case, is it actually worthwhile adding a new treatment, or are you better off in this case to start anew? As I said, unless you have sort of combinations or changes in doses or something like that, I think the assumption of independence is probably okay in many cases. But as I said, the decision to add something might depend on what you found already in the past, and that causes, I think, poses some interesting questions.
Use the word interesting.
Where?
Oh.
Wait, there you go.
So I want to go back to this question about whether family-wise error rate is actually a sensible thing to control, because I was wondering whether so I'm starting from an axiom that platform trials are unambiguously a sensible thing, because they seem to be. Does it kind of create a perverse disincentive? You know, you've got a new treatment that you really believe in, but by adding it, you're sort of, you know, in a way, if you really believe in it, you'd almost be better off setting up a new trial to you know, to
Yes.
maximise the chance
No,
of it going through.
I mean,
and
you're absolutely right. However, everybody believes that that treatment is working.
exactly,
Right?
that's the problem.
So therefore, you're back in the situation where everything is compared like for like. But I think your point is quite valid. Again, it goes back to what I've alluded to before. Maybe at the point where you found something, you might say, okay, this is the end of my inferential unit of a platform, and then I start my new inferential unit to compare against, so that I don't penalize for the fact that I have already found something in the past. But I would argue that everybody believes that that thing works anyway. And yes, if you have any evidence that one is definitely going to be better than another, by all means, I mean, you're better off doing something else.
That's why I said a perverse disincentive, because I think, you know, we wouldn't want that happening, but there might be an inclination for investigators to think like that.
If there's any questions online, please raise your hand and we'll unmute you.
I think get to throw it at you, Brian.
We just wanted to catch it once, I think.
If there's no further questions, let's thank Thomas again for a really interesting talk. And I'd like to invite